International economist and New York Times best-selling author Dr. Dambisa Moyo believes the challenge of unemployment and joblessness is not unique to Africa. She believes Africa's leaders have to identify sustainable policy targets directed at strategic outcomes to the challenges of joblessness and inequality. She was talking to producer Buntu during a short visit to Johannesburg.
First of all, the problem of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is not just an African problem, it's a global problem. So I think it's very important, particularly when people are talking about Africa, to stop this habit of painting Africa like it's facing unique challenges and nowhere else these challenges exist. The ILO over the last couple of years has put out a report that says there are over 80 million youth who are unemployed around the world. We know what these statistics look like in places like Spain, where some estimates are saying around 50% of young people are unemployed. In very large, massive populations such as China, India, Brazil, Mexico, very, very large populations, the issues around unemployment are stark. And even in the more developed economies such as the United States and across developed Europe, issues of unemployment are an issue. Coming to your specific question around Africa, you are right that there are challenges, and unemployment is one of those challenges. Remember that over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. In countries like Uganda, over 50% of the population is under the age of 15. The question is not whether or not we have challenges. Of course we have challenges. The question is, what can we do about them? And in my mind, I think the biggest problem is that there has been a predilection or a preference to focus on formal employment as the only solution for solving this burgeoning young population and these issues around unemployment. And I think what we really need to do is take a leaf out of the books of some of the other countries. India, I think, is a good example, where we, in parallel to formal education, which, by the way, remains a very important thing we should all aspire for, but given constraints, it might not always be possible. I think we need to take a leaf out of the book of places like India, where it's clear that the policymakers are engaging in ways to encourage entrepreneurship, to encourage the development of other sectors that perhaps do not require a long, full, extensive formal education that it would be nice, but it is not necessarily feasible at this time. Some of the other sectors, and some of the sectors are technology, of course, but also, which some people might argue, well, that's very heavily in requirements in terms of labor. But call centers, for example, are something that perhaps doesn't require as much in terms of formal training, and yet has been a massive draw for employment in India.
Dr. Moyo also added that it is a misperception to believe that China was merely exploiting Africa. Buntu had asked her whether resource shortages could be a catalyst for conflict and a threat to global trade.
Yes and no, it can be a problem. First of all, I think there's a lot of misinformation. There are now, if I recall correctly, something like 20 stock exchanges across the African continent, and over 1,000 stocks that trade in those economies. Over 85% of the stocks are non-commodity stocks. They're banks, they're insurance companies, telecommunications companies, but they're not all commodities. So that's point one, okay? So I think the association in people's minds that Africa must be a commodity story, they're missing out on a bigger trade that's going on here. The second question, or second point I should say, is that you are right that traditionally in history, economic history, countries that have large endowments of resources have tended to underperform countries that have less resources. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of the most common examples is Dutch disease, the fact that these economies, because they have an internationally demanded resource, tend to attract in foreign currencies, let's say dollars, and that causes an appreciation of their exchange rate, which kills off the domestic economy because the currency is too strong. So we know that that's the case, but there are exceptions to this rule. And I know it's not in Africa, but I think we should again look to the performance of other economies. Norway is a great example. It has significant oil resources, but it has been able to manage those resources in a very compelling way. These resources are scarce, they are finite, and they are depleting. So it is absolutely essential that policymakers understand that and manage those resources appropriately. Africa has the most untilled arable land left in the world. China, with 1.3 billion people, more than Africa's population, has 7% arable land. It needs to engage with Africa. And I know that traditionally this continent has been at a distinct disadvantage because we should be primary producers, able to feed ourselves, but also able to feed the rest of the world, given our amount of primary resource. We have been blocked. America has had a farm subsidy bill that does not allow us to sell goods there. The Europeans have the common agriculture policy, but the world has changed.